I just want to introduce to you, pleasure to introduce to you Stuart Mangrum, Director of Education for the Burning Man Project. Burning since '93, Stuart helped produce Black Rock City's first newspaper, radio stations, and live webcasts, and was an organizer of one of the first theme camps. In 2013, he rejoined the Burning Man Project to focus on community learning and leadership development. He was co-author of the last 7 annual events, art themes. Can you please give a warm welcome to Stuart Mangrum?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I got to say that despite my fancy title, I am not an academic. I just want to make that clear. But I am a lifelong learner, and I have been studying Burning Man for a long time. Actually, I've been trying to figure out what Burning Man is for about 25 years, and I'm still not there. But that's okay, because I've always appreciated a good question better than an easy answer. And I think there's still lots of questions to figure out. I mean, part of the problem of figuring out what Burning Man is that, well, you gotta realize that it's not really one story, it's a million stories. And each of those stories is the one story for that one person, if you know what I mean? And trying to navigate the spread between my individual story and your individual story and the story of us as a collective is actually a humbling experience. Years ago, I think back in 1997, my friend Marion Goodell asked me to write a piece about Burning Man for a book by Boing Boing. Do you remember that? And I couldn't write it except in the second person. I had to write it as you are standing on an empty and desolate plain, because I didn't want my story to get in the way of your story. And I still believe that Burning Man is an individual experience that way. And at the same time, though, I think it is possible to kind of zoom out a little bit and trace some through lines. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, sort of trace maybe what some commonalities are within those stories. So if there's one story of Burning Man, it of course begins with this fellow, Larry Harvey. For no one really knows why, and he never even really knew why. One summer in 1986, he decided to call up his friend Jerry James and said, hey, why don't we knock together a 8-foot-tall wooden man and take him down to the beach and burn him on the solstice? And Jerry said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So they took him down to an isolated beach in San Francisco, Baker Beach, and set it on fire. And it seemed to work because people showed up. And over the next few years, they did it again and again and again. More people showed up until in 1990, the cops showed up and said, can we see your permit, please? They said, well, we don't really have a permit. So they decided to not burn it that year. So they had a man, no place to burn it. But Larry had some friends from the Cacophonous Society, particularly these two guys, John Law and Michael, who said, we know a place where you can burn it. Why don't we take it out to the middle of nowhere where there are no cops in the Nevada desert? So they took it out to the Black Rock Desert, they set it up out there, and then they burned it 125 miles or so from the nearest authorities. And it was a success, and over the years more and more people showed up, and the little camp turned into a little city, and then it turned into a bigger city. There were some management changes. Some of the original people left, some new people came in. By the end of the 20th century, it was fairly stabilized at that. And by the beginning of the 21st century, people around the world were saying, hey, we want to take Burning Man back home with us. So Larry wrote a document called the 10 Principles. The culture spread around the world, and the end. Any questions? That's it. That's my whole story. Thank you. Obviously, there are a few gaps in that story. To begin with, there were only 8 people. And by the time Larry actually wrote the 10 Principles in 2004, Black Rock City was a city of 35,000 people. So clearly there were more stories that weren't there. And when Larry wrote the 10 Principles, he was always very clear about this. It happened not in the beginning, it happened midway through this process. It's not like he woke up one morning with the idea of Burning Man as a culture in his head, and it sprang fully formed from his brow like Venus from the brow of Zeus. He said it was based on a very careful observation of the people who created the culture, the people who came out and formed the community of Burning Man. So we got to ask, who were those people that he was observing? And that's what I want to get into today with a spirit of humility. Because that list of attributes, those values, those were based on people who had those values. And they didn't make them up on the spot either. They showed up to the party, obviously, with some context, with some history, with some influences of their own. So A lot of them were, of course, from the San Francisco Cacophony Society, myself included. And my story, personally, is that I didn't know about Burning Man as anything but a cacophony event. I learned about it through the Cacophony Society. So we're going to trace a little bit more about that. But before we go there, I want you to understand that the Cacophony Society was one of many scenes within a vast, swirling, underground Venn diagram of San Francisco in the 80s and the 90s. There were a lot of interrelated scenes. And Cacophony was, to some extent, kind of an Uber scene in that it was a bit of a social network for those other scenes. It was the only one of those groups that had a newsletter. So you could publish your event in the Cacophony newsletter, and so there was a lot of cross-pollination. We all went to each other's events, we all supported each other, and by the turn of the century, most of those other groups were also represented on Playa. So I just wanted to do a quick lateral tour. One of those groups was Survival Research Laboratories. The Machine Art Collective, founded by Mark Pauline. Now, Mark himself never went to Burning Man. He thought it was stupid, but a lot of his people that he trained and brought up in his shop did. So some of the spin-off groups like People Hater and Seaman were instrumental in some of the early Burning Man art. If you've ever enjoyed a flame poofer, you know what flame poofers are? That big fireball? Well, you can thank Tristan Risto and Cal Spelatic of SRL, because they invented that, right? So there was certainly an aesthetic of that worked its way into the culture. The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, a performance activist troupe of many. There's a long tradition of that in San Francisco. I would also address the San Francisco Mime Troupe was part of that. But the Sisters were also very prominent in early Burning Man society. I think in my early days of the newspaper, I looked around the newsroom one day and found that 2 out of 4 of my original volunteers were all drag nuns. And today, I'd say Black Rock City is, you can talk about diversity issues, but I think it is still one of the most queer-friendly places on earth, and I think they had something to do with that. The art car scene was just starting to take off, so there were a lot of people driving rides like this. And when they found out that we had a desert where they could bring even bigger and more dangerous and more insane vehicles, a lot of them showed up. There was a fake church, and there is, called the Church of the Subgenius, that a lot of us lapped over with. In fact, a lot of cacophonists were, or are, also popes, or anti-popes, or saviors or anti-saviors in the Church of the Subgenius. Also, this is in the context of pre-internet. Right before the dawn of the internet, there was what some people would call a mail art scene, or the zine scene. People would make artifacts, pieces of art, or small magazines, and exchange them with each other, mostly through the mails. This is how I made my entree into Cacophony Society, because I had one of these. From about 1990 through most of the decade, my wife and I published a little zine called Twisted Times. Now, we had some distribution in bookstores. There were a few hipster bookstores that would stock these little magazines, but mostly it was through the mails. And in order to qualify for a bulk mail permit, in other words, to get the cheap rate, you had to have, I believe it was at least 200 pieces of mail. So our mailing list never got really much over 100 or 150, so we traded with a lot of other zines. And there was a zine called Fact Sheet 5 that was like a zine of zines, so you could say like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. And so we do all these trades, and every week my mailbox would fill up with all this wonderful weirdness. And one of the zines that I got in exchange was called Rough Draft. Now, not really a zine. Rough Draft was the newsletter of the San Francisco Cacophony Society. And in this, I would read about all these marvelous, insane events. Like, imagine that you're taking a bus in San Francisco and a clown gets on the bus. No big deal. But you stop at the next bus stop and another clown gets on the bus. And you stop at the next bus stop and another clown gets on the bus. And by the end of the line, the bus is full of clowns and they're all pretending they don't know each other. I thought, that sounds really fun. But for years, I was an armchair cacophonist. I referred to all of these people that I exchanged zines with as my invisible friends. Until one fateful summer, I decided to throw a party, and I invited some of my invisible friends, and one of them showed up. This guy, Michael, one of the cacophony organizers, showed up. And over drinks, I said, okay, you kind of got me busted because I've just been an armchair participant in your very participatory culture. I'll swear right on the spot, I will go to the next event in your cacophony calendar, whatever it is. And he said, great, you'll love it. It's called Burning Man. So that is how I was voluntold, or something, to become the publisher of the Black Rock Gazette. So my first Burning Man, 1993, I spent inside a trailer producing a newspaper, had a marvelous time. 1993, I think there were about 700 people there. I saw this guy too, and I'm like, I think I want to do a theme camp. So my wife and I decided the next year we would bring a theme camp, and we started Tiki Camp, and well, I'm kind of getting ahead of the story. The Cacophony Society, let's get a little bit deeper in this. If you look at that little introduction, which appeared in the head of every Rough Drafts newsletter, I think you can see some of the principles already there, can't you? The fact that you may already be a member was really the biggest one, right? Does that speak to radical inclusion, perhaps? I think so. Randomly gathered network, free spirits, experiences beyond the pale of mainstream society. So as we started to explore the Cacophony universe and we found there were many, many different kinds of events. Cacophony was kind of a clearinghouse, and it was essentially a duocracy. Anybody could run an event. All you had to do was basically the only rules, if there were rules, were it had to be non-commercial and it couldn't be overtly political. And as long as you met those two criteria, they'd list your event, and if people showed up, they showed up. And if no one showed up, no one showed up. It was up to you, right? So those events took many, many styles. Some of them were appropriations of public space. A lot of them were actually appropriations of public space. There were a variety of spy versus spy or hunter-killer games where various teams would try to find each other in the streets of the city. This is a picture of a bridge event. Another type of appropriation. We love climbing up on high places. Imagine having a cocktail party on the Golden Gate Bridge, or having a karaoke lounge inside a BART train car. Lots of transgressive events in public spaces, repurposing or recycling them. One extreme of that is the Atomic Cafe events, where we took over underground space in an abandoned military base and turned it into a nightclub, a post-apocalyptic nightclub. There were some more prankish events too. This is a protest of the beloved Disney movie Fantasia, which you would think nobody would have anything bad to say about, but we managed to come up with some bad things to say about it. And this actually made its way into the media and was covered by newspapers all over the country. The people were outraged over Fantasia. I just had to have one more Fantasia protest slide because Fantasia. There were some that were pretty much pure Dada street theater. These are the Salmon. Every year in San Francisco, there's a big fun run across the city called the Beta Breakers, and the Salmon every year run the race in the wrong direction. They swim upstream against the human stream and spawn on Hayes Hill and freak the people out. This is one that's been going on and on. They're still doing it in these kind of cheesy foam suits. Another appropriation of public space would be the urban Iditarod, which is exactly like the Iditarod in Alaska, except with shopping carts instead of dog sleds and people instead of dogs. Another one that's caught on and has been cloned or copied around the world. There's now a famous one in Chicago every year called Chi-Ditarod. They turned it into rather a big public service event. They raise vast amounts. They fill their shopping carts with food and distribute those to people who need food. So that was an event that took on a life of its own. But some events were too political to be listed as actual cacophony events. We did have a section in the newsletter called Sounds Like Cacophony, or sometimes we called it Smells Like Cacophony. One of those events was Let Them Eat Cake, where a lot of cacophonists exercised their passion for costumery by dressing up as 18th century aristocrats and handing out breadcrumbs to the homeless as a protest against city homelessness policy. Several of them were actually arrested in those fancy outfits and wigs, and there's some great arrest photos, which I wasn't able to get a hold of. There was an overt Dada thread throughout cacophony events. There were a lot of Dada events. And any time that any of Jari's plays were staged, you know that there were cacophonists both on stage and in the audience. There was a passion for our friend Ubu, who never seems to go out of style. I think some people say that in America we have a president, Ubu. I don't know. There was a big overt or acknowledged debt to the Dadaists. Cacophony also existed in other cities by the end of the century, too. There was a heavy contingent in Los Angeles. There was a Portland Cacophony Society. There was a Seattle Cacophony Society. These are some of the LA cacophonists in an event they called Clowns for Christ, where they wanted to see how many different parades they could budge their way into and march as Clowns for Christ. They had a little bit of a darker attack to some of their events, I would say. they also came up with this pretty awesome and awful prank, the cement cuddlers. They basically had bought a bunch of adorable children's teddy bears, took out the stuffing and filled them with cement, and made up some very, very bleak tags, product tags, and put them back on the shelves. They made children cry, which is not cool at all, but... Can I say, pranks sometimes get a little dark. Speaking of dark pranks, SantaCon. Regrettably, yes, SantaCon started as a cacophony event. I think in the first year there were 30 Santas on a bus. Now I think there's about 3 million Santas in every city around the world. I am deeply, deeply sorry for that. It's when the Cacophony book was published a few years ago, the best review that I read of it had a phrase in it. They said that they referred to Burning Man in relation to the Cacophony Society as the child that devoured its parent. If that's the case, then SantaCon is the child that stole its parents' car, emptied its parents' bank account, burned down its parents' house, and broke its parents' hearts. Now, there are also some fringe groups. Cacophony had a shadowy sister group called the Billboard Liberation Front, which was also a spin-off of the Suicide Club, whose sole mission in life was to go out and improve billboards. It seemed to be missing something, like the actual message. This was sort of an Apple campaign where the phrase "think different" was adjusted a little bit to reflect the nature of the celebrity that they had stolen. But a whole history of going out and appropriating public advertising and sort of diverting the spectacle, if you will, with new messages. I like that last one a lot. AT&T works in more places, like, hey, NSA headquarters. The Apple campaign was a long one, and the first one was actually one of the very first boards that was improved back in the Suicide Club days. There was a style of cacophony event that led most directly to the Burning Man and cacophony convergence. It was called a zone trip. Now, the zone trip was inspired by a classic Russian science fiction movie. Has anyone ever seen Stalker by Tarkovsky? Yeah. I mean, the theme of that is that these adventurers called stalkers go into these zones of mystery and adventure and danger and bring out artifacts. So an early cacophonist named Cary Galbraith said, well, why don't we just treat the regular world as if it were the zone and take trips into places that we thought we knew, but if we realigned our mental geography, we might be able to come up with a new relationship too. So she led the first zone trip to her hometown of Covina, California, which is not a very mysterious and exciting place. It's a suburb down in Los Angeles. But they managed to reinvent that. So over the years, a number of other zone trips went to other places. One of my favorites was down to Tultepec in Mexico, a town where the only industry is fireworks. They have this 10-day-long fireworks festival where they blow things up in the street. But that's how Burning Man went to the Black Rock Desert. It hitchhiked along with a zone trip to the Black Rock Desert that had actually already been in planning before the cops showed up and made the man go away. So they took the man out there and they burned it out in the Black Rock Desert, the biggest expanse of nothing in North America. Now, where did the Cacophony Society come from? We do have to trace the tree back a little bit. It was the offspring of a group called the San Francisco Suicide Club, which pursued a lot of the same types of events, but under a different sort of an aesthetic. The name Suicide Club comes from a short story by Robert Louis Stevenson of the same title, about a group of people who all agreed to basically live their life from day to day under the hardest possible terms. They sign an agreement that says that any one of them can be killed at any time. Pretty dark. So all Suicide Club members agreed to get their worldly affairs in order, enter into the world of chaos, cacophony, and saturnalia, and live each day as if it were the last. So a lot of the types of events that we saw in Cacophony, but also a few that were a little bit darker, they had a style of event called Into the Unknown, where you might be blindfolded and taken God knows where. This is the same picture we saw earlier. Is Gary in there? No, I'm not seeing him. But that's Gary. Love those mutton chops. This is like circa 1978 or so. Yes, he was a hippie. He ran a program out of Communiversity, which was San Francisco's free hippie university in the late 1970s. He offered a number of classes that led to the creation of the Suicide Club. He also ran a free store called the Gorilla Grotto. Now, free stores should tell you what flavor of hippie he was. I get kind of pissed off sometimes when people talk about Burning Man as a hippie thing, but within the broad panoply of hippiness, there were some distinct subcultures within hippies. One of them were the diggers. Diggers like to operate free stores where everything was on sale. Nothing was for sale, everything was for free. They also like to dress up in crazy costumes, parade through the streets. Is this looking familiar to anyone? Another group that was at the fringes of hippie culture that I think you could call an influence were the Yippies, who did a takeover of Disneyland, for instance. If you trace it back a little bit further, you can say that all of those groups were influenced by some of these guys. Dada, we already mentioned, was a very overt influence. Surrealism, I think you can probably see, is certainly present in today's Burning Man art. And the Situationists. I'm going to take a little deeper dive into them really quickly. Not that any of us woke up one day and said, hey, I'm a Situationist. Most of us kind of discovered this sideways. But it's like looking through an old photo album and seeing people who look exactly like you. So the Situation is a response to alienation and divorcement from normal life by creating, I love this, deliberately constructed collective organization of a unitary ambience in a game of events, which sounds to me just a little bit like Burning Man. The Situationists also theorized or talked about the notion of the spectacle, which is the unholy convergence of advertising and propaganda techniques and behavioral psychology to create this fake world that supposedly some people live in. And with the advent of social media, people live in all the time and participate very fully in. Psychogeography, the notion of, you can think about that idea of the zone trip as being very much an example of dérivé, or the drift, which in situationist terms might have been expressed by, say, navigating the streets of London using a map of Paris. And détournement, the idea of basically culture hacking. So all of that Billboard Liberation Front you can see as an example of détour, and pretty much all of what we think about as punk rock culture. These two guys ended up fighting. Guy Debord kind of won. Raoul Vaneigem, his notion was rather than an armed revolution, it was the revolution of everyday life. That perhaps the change might start within us, and that might be how we revolutionize the world. But he dropped out, Debord won, his Marxist tendencies took over, he put all of his money on the Paris insurrection in 1968, and the group folded. Now, I think that's a great example of how we're really not like the Situationists, because in my experience with Burning Man, we've never been about tearing down the system. We've never been about opposing something. I get a little bit angry when people talk about Burning Man as a counterculture. It's not really counter to anything, it just is a culture, right? Much more about creating our own imaginary city than about trying to take over somebody else's. Certainly filling it up with surrealist art, creating lovely interactive play spaces where people can go crazy. We still have a strong tradition of costumery that you can take from some of those earlier groups. We have a strong tradition of rather Dada-esque interactive play. We have a strong tradition of basically doing whatever you want in terms of radical self-expression. And of course, we still love to play with fire. Now, how much of this came out of our cacophonous background? I wanted to kind of end with this slide again. Knowing what you know now and having seen some of those examples, I think some of them are really obvious, right? It's very obvious where radical inclusion might be linked back to the Cacophony Society's invitation, making it an explicitly open invitation. It's pretty obvious how decommodification might kind of have its roots in that notion of perhaps a free store or gifting. Some of them are perhaps not as obvious. And it's funny, Larry and I used to have a running friendly argument about this. He claimed that every one of those principles was present from the beginning on Baker Beach. My claim was that at least 9 of them were present in cacophony events and in the cacophony ethos. Can you guess which one I thought was maybe discovered later on in life? Civic responsibility. Interesting you should say that, yeah. Larry's claim was that by deciding to not burn the man in 1990, that was an action of civic responsibility. I took the position that by immediately running away to a place that was 125 miles from the nearest law enforcement officer and burning it there was not. I think we both agreed, though, that the real origin of civic responsibility in the sense that we look at it was when we first started going out there and there was nobody to save anybody. So I would say the creation of the Black Rock Rangers, who originally, their purpose was to rescue people who got lost out in the desert and might have actually died out there because they couldn't find Burning Man. There was that notion that we had to step up into the role of being a civic authority, right? And taking on the roles that ordinarily we would rely on government to do for us. That, I think, was the real origin of civic responsibility. So what else on there? I'm curious. What else do you think that you might trace back to Cacophony and to the Suicide Club? Anybody see any threads there?
Everything but leaving no trace.
Leaving no trace?
Everything but leaving no trace.
Leaving no trace actually was part of the aesthetic, certainly of Billboard Liberation Front. Billboard Liberation Front, some of my partners in that were actually sign men, and they had a lot of sympathy for the guy who had to go and clean up the mess afterwards. So we always took care to make our improvement art easily removable. We used double stick tape and had a technology where we would just pot it up so they could pop it off, and we'd always leave a six-pack for the sign men who had to dismantle it. But no, as far as Cacophony goes, it wasn't explicit, right? It wasn't as explicit as it should be free and it should be open to everyone. What else? Things that are or aren't represented in the Cacophony ethos.
Gifting. Everything's free.
So, running a free store, maybe? Yeah. And another part of the standard Cacophony intro and rough draft was all events were free and in San Francisco unless otherwise stated. And that was part of the aesthetic, was that you really weren't supposed to charge people for events. And if it was a commercial event, it wouldn't get listed.
Was radical self-reliance implied, or?
Radical self-reliance. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I would say that, I don't know, what do you think?
That's probably obvious, but not stated.
Degree of importance varies depending on what sort of event you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
but it certainly seems implicit in some of the things you were talking about.
Implicit but not stated.
Well, one of the things about Cacophony was anybody could do an event, but nobody was going to do your event for you. You could ask for help from other people, and you could persuade other people to join in your adventure. But it was very much a duocracy in that sense. So, to me, that kind of speaks to radical self-reliance.
As does the you could get arrested for doing this, but you can do it if you feel like it.
Right. We called those events no warrant ID required events. Because if one person was arrested, the whole group was in peril. So you had to have your ID with you. So if you were stopped by the cops, you could look like a regular citizen. And people who had outstanding warrants were invited to not come along because they could be taken in for that.
How many times were you arrested?
Only once that shows up on my record. I was arrested.
You're in Switzerland, you can tell.
I was arrested on New Year's Eve of the year 2000, halfway up the Oakland Bay Bridge in a tuxedo with a backpack full of martinis.
Oh.
And spent the night in the drunk tank sober. Yeah, it was amazing. One of those life experiences that you look back and you go, God, that was a great story I got out of that. That's the best thing I can say. All right, we got a few more minutes for questions. What else do you want to talk about? Yeah.
In your experience at Coffee Society, were there ever moments they had to forcibly exclude members, or say even though everyone was welcome, X person did that, or Y person has a warrant? Like, aside from constraints of the event, was there exclusion ever happening at coffee events?
No, not that I can recall. I mean, we would kind of shun people by not going to their events. Okay, that was about it, right? Everything was, people voted with their feet, I would say, is what it really was. But the meeting was always open. There was a monthly meeting that everybody was invited to come to, no matter how crazy or obnoxious they were. And everybody got equal space and equal opportunity. So it was very much, it's interesting, the Suicide Club was a much more secretive organization and harder to get into. And the people who survived that and started Cacophony thought that was a flaw. So they very intentionally made it an open organization and baked that into the rules, right, that it would always be open to the public.
I didn't pay attention when you were listing the different organizations, which ones have survived to today. What survived from this, besides Burning Man, what survived from this group, and activities that they did in San Francisco?
I'd say pretty much all of them that I mentioned. Yeah, Survival Research Lab still does a show occasionally. They do more shows in Europe than they do in the States. They have a long-running battle with fire departments and police departments around various parts of the United States. The sisters are still rocking it. They're still doing their Hunky Jesus competition every Easter. Church of the Subgenius won't die, even though they have incorrectly predicted the end of the world, I think 3 times now. People keep showing up. So
Suicide Club is not.
Suicide Club is not, no. Of the lateral groups that I talked about, I believe all of those are. Yeah, Suicide Club crashed and burned long before our story starts, really, before the first burn on the beach. Yeah.
And which people from those society are still involved in Burning Man?
Stuart.
Michael is still around. I believe this guy was around in those days, Mr. Raspa. Any other members? Actually, you're all members.
I took the coffee events before I went to Burning Man.
Then you're a member. So Marianne's a member? Yes.
I was just wondering if you might speculate a little bit about what was going on in San Francisco in the 80s around this kind of public theater culture that made this such a flourishing spot in comparison with other U.S. cities or...
That's a great question, and I don't know. I think that's an interesting area of research that I would love to see somebody pursue. All I know is that I just dropped in the middle of it. I showed up in San Francisco in '88, and I was just amazed at how much crazy stuff was going on. I remember coming into the city and seeing my first Survival Research Labs poster, and their show posters, if you've ever seen one, are insane. You should look them up. They have these terrifying images, and they have these wonderful titles, like The Systematic Destruction of Ritual Objects Condensed Over Time. You know, all their titles are like 20 words long. Caveat? And
Yeah, talking with people about that subject, no one's really sure, but I know John Law, for example, said that he came and a bunch of other people came because there was already a scene there and they felt like they missed the Summer of Love and all of that, but that a bunch of people were brought in because there was already a counterculture, and then that turned into, in some ways, the music scene and the punk movement, but so there was, in some ways it may have been because a lot of other things were already happening. It's not an answer, but it's come up in conversation.
Yeah, I was going to answer in the same fashion, even myself. Books like On the Road influenced a lot of who came to San Francisco. Larry says that he came there right before the Summer of Love because there was an arts scene and a creative scene and a cafe scene. And so he would, when we would talk, it's often that it was the Beat generation of the 50s. And again, On the Road is influential in the history of San Francisco. And I mean, he frequently talked about that Burning Man could not have come out of any other American city, but the landscape was rich and fertile for all of these groups. I mean, I don't think it is a chance that all of those groups came out of San Francisco. This is not New York, which is obviously a cultural melting pot, but San Francisco allows a sense of freedom, and you can actually, in a way, even look at the 10 principles and imagine that so much of what is San Francisco culture, there's bits of that there that you won't find anywhere else. I mean, there are things you can't find really in a city, but the city of San Francisco has really helped bear forth the fruit of this interactive culture.
that's a really great point. I mean, San Francisco has a history of welcoming weirdos and eccentrics dating all the way back to the gold rush. So you think about radical inclusion, and you think about radical self-expression and self-reliance, is a particularly Westerner sort of a thing. There was one bar in the back? Yes.
Yeah, so in Sweden, in the university cities, we've had things like this at least 1911 or something like that, essentially the student culture doing very equivalent things. Has student culture fed into this movement, or as a parallel rising?
All I can say is that Gary Warren was very much a college dropout, and Communiversity was an alternate student structure set up for the street hippies who didn't want to stay in college. So I can't really see any direct parallels off the top of my head to student culture. Yeah, I think I'm getting the hook here. Thank you very much.
Please.